If you had invested $10,000 in this cloud computing ETF 10 years ago, right now you'll be sitting on $54,000. Let me introduce to you First Trust Cloud Computing ETF. Now, this ETF has done fantastically over the last 5 years. Over the last 5 years, it's done 27% per annum. And if you compare that against S&P 500, you have an excess gain of close to 11% more per year. Now, today I'll be discussing First Trust Cloud Computing ETF. I'll also try to explain to you, an overview about the whole cloud computing space. I'll also try to justify, will growth actually slow moving forward? And as well as compare First Trust Cloud Computing ETF versus some of the other alternatives in the market. And last but not least, I'll also give you a quick learning point from what you can take away from today's tutorial. So with that, let's roll in the intro video. Hi guys, welcome back. Now let's start by giving an overview of the whole cloud computing space. So if you're an expert, do leave in the comment sections, we can learn from you also. For myself, I'm pretty layman. So I'm going to explain in terms of layman wise. So let me pull up a chart. This is actually a chart showing the top 10 advantages of cloud computing. I'll touch on a few key points where I understand myself, that I can relate myself. And the first one starts with this: less cost. It's quite obvious. With cloud computing, you don't need your own server. And point number 3, on the top right hand corner, you see over there, flexibility in capacity. Now, I have a friend who's working in a cloud computing firm, and he's actually shared with me, when TraceTogether first came on board, they encouraged a lot of Singaporeans to take up TraceTogether and download the app. And if I'm not wrong, from what I hear from him, TraceTogether actually had a crash, something like that, because there was so much excessive download. The whole cloud computing part is you can increase your capacity with just a click of a button. That's my understanding of things. I run a website myself, The Astute Parent. Check it out, show some love there also. I touch on some concepts on financial planning. And what I've realized is when there are surges in traffic, it can cause the website to crash also. It could be a very viral article. It could be a deal, a promotion I'm pushing. So with cloud computing, you actually increase and decrease the capacity you need in terms of your bandwidth. The third part that I understand myself is point number 6, security. In the previous video we've done before, it's mentioned that ransomware attacks are coming very frequently. Every 6 seconds, an enterprise software is being interfered with a ransomware, a malware, something like that, and increasingly so. So if you have your host not by yourself but by AWS or Azure, who are the 2 leading players, you get a lot more security. So these are real benefits of the whole cloud computing space. But the $1 million question which I can help you more as an investor is, will growth in cloud computing slow down? Now, let me pull up some white paper that's actually done by ARC. They've actually done a full explanation of this whole cloud computing space, which I'll leave links below, just in case you are keen to find a bit more for yourself. The first part that we need to understand is, the demand from businesses and public seems to be moving upwards as we digitalize, correct? But let's pull on some graphs to explain things. This is the first thing that we need to understand for ourselves. Is remote working going to be permanent moving forward? At least for myself, I think so. I'm very happy working from home right now. Previously, in my role as an advisor, I have to go down to Starbucks or customer's office or customer's home to do a presentation, but right now I do it through Zoom. It saves everybody time. So I think it's a permanent shift for myself, and this graph really explains things. Microsoft Teams users shot up. What about Zscaler cloud security traffic? Shot up. And Zoom meeting participants, wow, this growth is phenomenal. So I'm part of that Zoom revolution. I'm pretty old school, so I only know how to use Zoom, so pardon me for it. What we can see in this graph over here is that cost for cloud computing is certainly cheaper than hosting it yourself. I checked with a friend of mine who works with a bank's IT. I think they are still holding the servers and stuff themselves rather than transiting to cloud. Maybe because of security, privacy, I don't know. But I think a lot of old firms are still hosting it themselves, and it's very expensive. So this graph really shows it's much cheaper doing it to the cloud, outsourcing it to them. And what has that translated to? It's translated to a much better growth forecast for this whole industry. On the right hand side, that's where ARK Invest is actually projecting 21% compounded annual growth rate all the way to 2030. Now the conclusion we can all draw is growth in cloud computing is not slowing down anytime. In fact, it could be argued that it's still at the infancy stage. But that does not translate to share price. Share price, will it do well in the next 1 year? Nobody knows. So hopefully we dissociate these two. Big picture wise, it's very rosy for the whole cloud computing space. So that's why we are moving on to the third part of today's discussion, which is using First Trust Cloud Computing ETF as an investment tool, or how does it fare against some of the other alternatives in the market? Let me introduce to you this graph over here. What we can see is on the left, First Trust Cloud Computing, and there's actually Global X Cloud Computing and Wisdom Tree Cloud Computing with tickers CLOU and WCLD respectively. The dark blue bar is actually First Trust Cloud Computing. But the main part of this 1 year graph that I'd like to highlight to you is the sentiment for the space is roughly the same. Outperformance in a bit or less doesn't really make a difference. So pick any of the three. I think that's the main message. They look roughly the same. And if you're on board with me on First Trust Cloud Computing, let me show you the 10-year history. You realize that I've mentioned that it's outperformed S&P. It's also outperformed NASDAQ over the last 10 years. The other two ETFs, CLOU and WCLD, have a much shorter track record. That's why I still prefer First Trust Cloud Computing as an allocation. So with that, let's deep dive into this ETF itself. We've actually done some homework for you. As of 31st of March, the top holding was actually Rackspace Technology, followed by VMware and Oracle Corporation. But as of end of June, you realize that the holdings are very different. On top is MongoDB, then second is Microsoft, and third Amazon. Wow, so there's actually quite a bit of shuffling in terms of its top holdings. Let me pull up also what is the top holding in CLOU and WCLD. In CLOU, you realize that the top holding is actually Zscaler, followed by Shopify and Zoom. For WCLD, which is Wisdom Tree Cloud Computing Fund, you realize it's Box Incorporation as well as Dropbox. So everybody's top holding is very different, correct? So if you flashback, what is the top holding for First Trust Cloud Computing with the ticker SKYY? You realize that MongoDB, Microsoft and Amazon are totally different from the other two competitors. But why are these on the top of the list? Let me show you the methodology behind this ETF itself. As mentioned, the index employs a modified equal weighted methodology. They give a score for IAAS, which is Infrastructure as a Service, PAAS, which is Platform as a Service, as well as SAAS, which is Software as a Service. And as you can see, is what is written there. IAAS and PAAS have a bigger weightage. They kind of favor that more over SAAS. That's my simple layman understanding of things. But again, should we second doubt it? I think also not so. We are not experts. So we are not the wiser making a guess whether that is a good methodology or not. When we pick an ETF, when we pick a fund, you go with what the methodology is and you go with the long-term approach of things. I think that's a much better way. So with that out of the window, let me address the top holding for SKYY, which is actually MongoDB. And before we get there, let me invite you to smash the like button because it's taken our team hours to prepare this presentation for you. So hopefully it's benefited you. And again, invite you to press on the subscribe because we're launching ideas in the coming weeks on how you can actually improve your finances. Now let's look at MongoDB specifically. I'm not an expert in IT, I've mentioned that many times, but what I can do is I can actually collate information to present to you for you to make your own judgment. And these are actually clips from what is mentioned by MongoDB's CEO. So let me roll in that part, but as a big picture, MongoDB is a competitor of Oracle, so it does database management. So this is what CEO has to say.
Incredibly powerful for developers because they don't have to make their applications accommodate the needs of the database anymore. It also means that they can adapt, adding new data when they need to, without worrying that a simple change is going to break everything. In addition to the document model, MongoDB is fundamentally different from legacy databases. That makes MongoDB something called a distributed database, and it allows MongoDB to provide 3 features that developers and architects would otherwise have to build for themselves, saving them massive amounts of risk and work.
So all sounds very rosy, correct? But before we get too much further, let me balance the argument with some things that I've discovered reading articles as well as analyst reports. So what we can see is while MongoDB is on a favorable wind building its revenue, some have actually mentioned that using this chart that the declining revenue per customer is worrying. Even though customer numbers are increasing in this blue bar over here, maybe those are lower end customers. Then the second part is some have mentioned direct sales. They use direct sales almost extensively, and that's why sales and marketing is still going to be high. And the third part is they still need to invest a lot in their platform. And that means that this firm is not likely going to be profitable at least for the next few years. Let me show you a graph for the profitability versus the revenue growth. This first graph over here shows that MongoDB has incurred more and more losses in each and every year moving forward. In 2021, that's the record number of losses. That is even with increase in revenue. So as you can see in this second graph over here, you realize that 2021 was a record year for MongoDB in terms of revenue. Having said that, what you realize in the yellow line over there is that the revenue growth seems to have stalled or is on a declining trend. Even though it's still at a respectable 40 to 50% year-on-year growth, the revenue drop has really spooked investors. That's why MongoDB's share price has not performed too well ahead of the recent moment. And as you can see over here, in the top 25 holdings for SKYY, you realize that MongoDB has actually been a detractor in performance, losing 19.3%. But they're not the worst on this whole list of top holdings. You realize that the worst is actually Fastly, who has lost more than 45%. If you contrast that to the top performer, LUMEN Technology, that has gained 50%. So one company has gained 50%, one company has lost 45%. Does that mean that if you're not an expert in the whole cloud computing space, isn't it better to buy diversified rather than go stock picking? You pick one, and what if it's the minus 45%? Everybody hopes to get that plus 50%, but if we are picking a loser, then naturally we're not benefiting from this whole revolution of cloud computing. So that's my take on things. Buy diversified. On the portfolio wise, you naturally see appreciation if most of the names are doing well, and let the portfolio's methodology really revise what should be a top holding and look long term. And if you'd like to benefit more from the whole cloud computing revolution, I've actually this previous video that touches on Keppel DC REIT and Mapletree Industrial Trust. I don't know if you've seen it before. Let me invite you there if you haven't seen. Mapletree Industrial Trust has really acquired a lot of data centers in US. They are the ones making big moves, and data centers are the infrastructure for this whole cloud computing revolution. Maybe it gives you more ideas whether data center REITs are a good part of your portfolio or not. So if that, I'll sign up from here and see you there. Take care and goodbye.